It's game day for the Memphis Grizzlies today. The Grizzlies will be playing their third preseason game, and we have a Jaren Jackson Jr. update, and it's a positive one. Let's get into all that coming up on Locked On Grizzlies. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host today, Damichael Cole, going solo without my guy Joe Mullinax today, but we're here to keep you updated and in tune to everything that's going on with the Memphis Grizzlies. It's been a busy time. It's been a busy preseason so far, a lot of moving pieces, and quite frankly, a lot of interesting things to get into. But today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline has you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. So don't forget, BetOnline is where the game starts. So thank you, of course, for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen each and every day, and your first watch as well if you're tuning in here on YouTube. So we appreciate you, and don't forget, as I always say, we're everywhere like the air. So Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you like to go listen to your podcast or watch, Locked On Grizzlies will be there waiting for you. We appreciate you, each and every one of you, for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies. And it's a big day today for the Grizzlies, their third preseason game of the season. But before we get down the road to that, we have even a more positive update for you on Jaren Jackson Jr. Talked to Coach Taylor Jenkins yesterday at practice, and he had some very positive things to say. For one, just from an observation perspective, from being at practice, Jaren Jackson Jr. Has been in, practice uniform, not practicing with the team, of course, but the fact that he's in practice gear kind of indicates what we've, one thing that I think people have wanted to hear is that Jaren Jackson Jr. is working on skill work. And he said this at media days, but it's another indication, seeing him in practice uniform shows that while the Grizzlies are at practice and they're doing some things, that he's potentially maybe doing some things off to the side, and he's getting the all-important skill work. Why is that skill work important for Jaren Jackson Jr.? Well, when you're injured, you don't want to overcompensate in certain areas sometimes, and that tends to happen for some players. Sometimes it can be a good. For example, if you hurt your right wrist and now you're forced to dribble with your left hand the entire time, and all of a sudden a player becomes as good as with their left hand as their right hand, if they're right-handed, and things like that. But in other ways, it can be a negative. So the fact that Jaren Jackson Jr. is getting the skill work, and if you remember in offseason, when we did our first offseason episode of Locked On Grizzlies, all the Grizzlies players at the exit interviews had a list of things they needed to work on in the offseason. You know who had the longest list of any player? Jaren Jackson Jr. Jaren Jackson Jr. had the longest list of things to work on. Taylor Jenkins really wanted to challenge him, and unfortunately, the injury derailed some of that process. But now he's doing skill work. So the update overall from Taylor Jenkins is centered less around the skill work and more on what Jaren Jackson Jr. has been able to do so far. So still, let's get the first thing out of the way. He is no contact. So no contact still for Jaren Jackson Jr. I think that's going to be a big development that people want to hear, down the stretch. But here's Taylor Jenkins' comments, and I'll read them exactly to you, word for word. He said he's starting to do a little more on the court. No contact, full court running, individual vitamins. Vitamins is, the Grizzlies' way of referring to just getting their individual regimen in. And then he said he's not just stationary. He's doing a little more dynamic, a step in the right direction compared to how camp started. I think that last sentence tells you everything you need to know in terms of where is he at now. A step in the right direction compared to where camp started. If you look at the beginning of camp, there was still optimism there. I don't think, just listening to, the conversations from media day, whether it was Zach Kleiman, whether it was Jaren Jackson Jr., who actually, when he talked about the 4 to 6 month timeline, he talked about, if anything, he feels like he's progressing real well and to the point where he could possibly beat that timeline. So I think all signs are positive, and hearing that it's a step in the right direction compared to where camp started should really be a good indication of good things to come. And this is big. Jaren Jackson Jr., not only is he a big piece to this Grizzlies team, to where they want to go, to what they can possibly do, but if you look at the Western Conference, I've said this time and time again, you're going to need Jaren Jackson Jr. And when it gets to March and it gets to early April and the Grizzlies are 2 games ahead of this team or 2 games behind that team, you're probably going to think back to that one game where Jaren Jackson Jr. didn't play, and it's like, if we would have had him, we could have accomplished this seed, that seed, or whatever the case may be. But the fact that, the signs are good so far can eliminate, that thought process. So here's just, an idea, of what the process could be like in a return to play. If Jaren Jackson Jr. returns, by the beginning of November, which would be closer to the exact 4-month timeline, and to 6-month timeline in July. So 4 months would be November in that case. So let's say the beginning of November, you're talking about him missing at least 7 regular season games. So not much of the regular season. And if you remember last season, the Grizzlies got off to an 8-9 start before winning 56 games. So missing the first, 7 or so regular seasons shouldn't be that big of a deal. Plus the Grizzlies have, a weaker schedule as compared to the rest of their schedule at the beginning. Let's say he returns by December 2nd. This is right in the middle. I think this is probably the most likely case scenario here. You're talking about a return by December 2nd. If he returns by that date, he would miss at least 21 games. So now you get to about a little over a third, about a fourth of the NBA season here, a little less than a fourth of the NBA season. And I think overall, like I said, this is probably the most likely case scenario, somewhere in that Thanksgiving, early December range. And still, again, the Grizzlies started 8-9 last season. So that was the first 17 games of the season. So you still have him back at a relatively early stretch where he can make a big impact on seeding. Then there's the January. This is closer to the 6 months of the timeline. And like I said, all indications so far are that he's ahead of that stretch. We'll see, things will change, possibly. Things could change. I won't say will. Things could change possibly over the course of his progression. And if that's the case, you're probably looking at closer to the 6 month timeline, which would be January. And if he returns in January, you're talking about missing about 35 games, at least 35 of the 82 games. So now you're getting closer to the halfway point of the season. And honestly, I think that would be more of a bummer. As we just said, the Grizzlies have big goals this season. They have championship goals. And of course, at the end of the day, you want to be your healthiest in April, but you don't want to give yourself the hardest slate. I think a 2 seed or 3 seed are reasonable, options. Being a 5 seed, granted, I forgot if the Mavs were the 4th or the 5th seed last season, but the number 1 seed was taken down in the semifinals, in the Western Conference semifinals last season. But still, it's not going to happen too regularly. So you want to give yourself the best path to success. And I think a 2-3 seed in that range would do that for the Grizzlies. So where Jaren Jackson Jr. is right now, basically, it seems like he's progressing real well. And he's a big piece. We've complimented Santi Aldama, who I think has eased the concerns that some of the fan base, that some of, maybe even the players have had about, Jaren Jackson Jr., the injury here. And as Taylor Jenkins said to me yesterday, he said that, at the end of the day, you can't replace Jaren Jackson Jr. It's a first-team all-defensive player. You're not going to replace the NBA's leading shot blocker with just one player. So the Grizzlies have a plan in place. The defensive scheme is still the same, but they're focusing on doing it as a unit. And we saw in that last game where they had 13 steals against the Magic, and you have Ja with multiple steals. You have Desmond Bane, getting steals as well. And Dylan Brooks, you don't need him to get as many steals because he's going to be locked in on the mission every time. And one-on-one defense against a certain, player. Santi Aldama was active defensively. Steven Adams had multiple steals. So you factor all of that in. I think the signs were pretty positive in that game. But speaking of positive signs, here's another positive sign. The Grizzlies on BetOnline are favored by 7.5 points tonight against the Miami Heat. So make sure you're going over to betonline.net to get more exclusive information on what's going on in the betting world. Remember, BetOnline is your number one source for all betting information, and that includes football, basketball, baseball, soccer, track, whatever's going on. BetOnline has you covered right now. BetOnline is big into the football betting information. This is where you find all of the latest player developments, team matchups, news, podcasts. You get in-depth articles on the analysis on every game you can find. You don't even have to be a big sports fan on these other sports like football, but BetOnline can fill you in so you can know where and what to wager. It's the fastest and easiest way to check in on all of your favorite games and events. And again, NFL season is here and MLB postseason. As most of you know, I'm a Braves fan. Let's go Bravos as we sit back and watch this wild card series play out. But BetOnline is where you go to get all your betting information. And remember, BetOnline is where the game starts. So it's preseason time here for the Grizzlies, and it's game number 3. Miami Heat is the opponent tonight. And I think the first question, when we see the Miami Heat, the first question you have to ask yourself is, who will play? Who's playing tonight against the Miami Heat? Well, Grizzlies fans, I've had some fans reach out to me, say, hey, Damichael, is this player playing? Is that player playing? Because I'm traveling from here, and here. And that's the thing with the preseason. You get these super cheap tickets. But the risk is Ja Morant might not play, or you're going to see Kenneth Lofton Jr., as some people may have in the last game, and he doesn't play, and things like that. So who's going to play? Well, a positive update on that is the Grizzlies are expected to employ the full roster today again. So everyone who was healthy was available in that Orlando Magic game, and the same should be the case against the Miami Heat today. Ja Morant, Desmond Bane, Dillon Brooks, Steven Adams, Santi Aldama, all of those guys are expected to be available according to head coach Taylor Jenkins. Now, on the Miami Heat side of things, no intel there, but just as a guessing man, I'm not expecting most of their best players to be available in this game. They just played, a couple nights ago. And, as with the case with the Grizzlies, when they played their first game of the season, preseason, they set out some guys, and then they had those guys be ready a couple nights later. When you have that 24 to 48-hour break, we're seeing a lot of preseason teams rest certain players. And the fact that the Heat played about, a couple days ago, and Kyle Lowry, Bam Adebayo, Jimmy Butler were some of the players who played in that game. Those players may not be available, so something to watch there. And that's probably why the BetOnline numbers are so big, 7.5 points in favor of the Grizzlies, because quite frankly, the Heat's key guys, Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo, Kyle Lowry, may not be available in this game. That's sort of a bummer in a way, because I've said, in the past, the Miami Heat game is the one game that I'm looking forward to in the preseason more than the others. Because after this, the Grizzlies go on the road for 2, but it's another game against the Orlando Magic. And then it's a game against a nice young team that I like, the Detroit Pistons. I think that could be a good one as well. But in one of those games, the Grizzlies are going to sit some guys out. And I think it could possibly be that Detroit Piston game. But we'll see. That's another conversation for later down the road. But at the end of the day, it's looking like the Grizzlies are going to play more of their main guys, and the Heat possibly won't play as many. So I think that's where we are from an availability perspective. And then Taylor Jenkins gave out some more good intel, I think, that'll be interesting for you to hear, and that's new lineup combinations for this game. There were a lot of players who I think we should expect to play together that didn't play together. There were some interesting combinations. I saw Ja Morant and Tyus Jones got a little bit of a run together in that past game. We mentioned Santi Aldama, playing with the starters, and Jake LaRavia, getting the run with the bench guys, Tyus Jones, John Conchar, Zaire Williams, and Brandon Clark, and so forth. But there are a lot of combinations we haven't seen yet. From a front court perspective, we did not see Santi Aldama and Brandon Clark. I think that is something that we should expect to see more of, possibly even a Brandon Clark, Steven Adams, pairing as well in the front court. Could we see that? That's that big jumbo-sized front court. We've seen Steven Adams shooting the three-pointer a little bit more in practice. We've seen Brandon Clark shooting the three-pointer more in practice. So from a spacing perspective, I think, there are some things that the team would have to work out. But, again, both of those guys are practicing the shot more. But how does that look on the wing? Well, I want to see one of those guards, pair the floor with Kennedy Chandler as well. Kennedy Chandler, I haven't talked about it much, but he looked really good in, that first preseason game. I thought his pace, the way he played in that game, and I talked with him, we had a good conversation, in between games, and he told me how just he feels so much better than he did, during Summer League, and not just from himself. Again, I've talked about how in Summer League, you're just kind of thrown out there with guys you haven't played much with. And he says, knowing, Jake LaRavia likes to shoot where he likes to shoot. David Roddy likes to run the floor, and, the way he runs the floor, and, where to get Kenneth Lofton Jr. the ball in mismatches and things like that. All those things are coming better to Kennedy Chandler, and it's allowing him to play less while thinking, the game. He can kind of play fluidly. He can kind of play freely. And Taylor Jenkins preaches that all the time. He doesn't put a number, hey, I want you to shoot 5 3-pointers in this game, or I want you to drive the ball 10 times. He doesn't do that to his players. He wants them to play free. And, he wants them to play with no limitations, with Ja Morant. I believe Taylor Jenkins was asked recently, do you tell Ja to save some of it for the regular season? Tone it down here, tone it down there. He said, no, I want Ja to play as free, and as free as possible. And I think, that is the mark of a head coach who gets his players, who understands his players, and he understands what is the best, way to maximize their potential, to maximize their talent. And before we get to our final and last point, I want to thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen each and every day. But make sure you check out the Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview starting on October 10th. It's a 6-episode extravaganza to get you ready for the NBA season. The local team experts like myself and my co-host Joe Mullinax and the NBA insiders of Locked On Podcast Network and Odyssey all will combine into one ultimate NBA preview. You can check this out starting October 10th. All you have to do is search the Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview 2022. You can do it on the Odyssey app. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Ultimate Pro Basketball Preview 2022, and you will find it there. So we're touching on these 3 points here on who will play. Taylor Jenkins, mentioned lineup combinations as another thing to watch for in this game. But there's a certain player, we talked about him in the previous episode as well, and that's Xavier Tillman. And I will say this, expect Xavier Tillman to get some run in this game as well, according to Taylor Jenkins. I think Xavier Tillman is in quite frankly, a tough spot right now. We mentioned the center depth. We mentioned, the rotation of the power forward. Santi Aldama getting minutes. Jake LaRavia getting minutes. David Roddy checked in before Xavier Tillman at that position as well. So you have 3 guys there who seem to be in front of Xavier Tillman. You have 2 centers who are definitely in front, and Brandon Clark and Steven Adams. That is the combo for the Grizzlies at the 5 position. So minutes are scarce for Xavier Tillman, but all signs are pointing to Xavier Tillman to get his first run. We know he's a very solid defender, good positional defender. He's going to be in the right spot. He moves very well. As we saw, in his matchup against Karl Anthony Towns, the Grizzlies kind of employed him against him in that playoff series because he was a more mobile option. So we'll see what he does and how he does. But Xavier Tillman is someone that you can expect to play against the Miami Heat. What about some other players? There are some other players that you might wonder if they're going to play against the Miami Heat. One in particular is a fan favorite. We're going to talk about that coming up after the break. This Miami Heat game, I think, is an interesting one because I wanted to see Bam Adebayo, and I wanted to see Ja driving the basketball at him. I wanted to see Jimmy Butler guarding Ja Morant, Jimmy Butler guarding Desmond Bane. I wanted to see Dylan Brooks guarding Jimmy Butler, and we may still get a glimpse of it. But as I said earlier, if I were the coach of the Heat, I'd probably rest those guys in this game, being the fact that they're traveling to Memphis and, they played a game a little over, 30 plus hours ago. So with all that being factored in, probably not going to see those guys. But there's another guy who is up in the air if we're going to see, and that's Kenneth Lofton Jr. Mentioned it earlier. It was the fourth quarter of the game. Things were getting quiet. FedEx Forum was probably about halfway crowded somewhere in there. And a chant broke out. Started to hear the fans, and you hear "We want Kenny. We want Kenny." For a second, I thought they were saying "We want Jitty," and in my mind, it's like he's played a decent amount of minutes today. Why are they saying "We want Jitty"? But then listened a little closer, and it was "We want Kenny," and it was right over there by the Grizzlies bench. The fans are chanting "We want Kenny. We want Kenny," and I thought, hey, it's preseason, right? Taylor Jenkins is going to do them a favor, bring him in the last couple of minutes. Why not? No. Taylor Jenkins is locked in on the game plan, just like we're locked on right here. He's locked in on the game plan, and Taylor Jenkins didn't budge. Kenneth Lofton Jr. did not play in that game. So will he play today? I think that's a big question that we actually don't have the answer to. It's still up in the air if he's going to play. I would expect him, to get some late run in this game, especially after not playing in that last game. But Taylor Jenkins has said he wants to try out new lineup combinations. What about Kenneth Lofton Jr. running with the second unit? That's one I personally want to see. And you can't tell me Taylor Jenkins hasn't thought about that option. If you look at the second unit, I think he could fit with that unit. People talk about defensively. Is he a liability? He is a bit of a different guy defensively. I remember David McClure, one of the assistant coach of the Grizzlies, he and I were talking during Summer League, and he was talking about, one, how they were getting Kenneth Lofton Jr. adjusted to the Grizzlies, style of play, and two, how they could possibly even, cater certain defensive looks to his style of play, to what he does well on defense. I would assume, that means maybe not having him switch onto the perimeter as much as a guy, like Brandon Clark would in those situations. So you look at the second unit right now, it's looking like it's Tyus Jones, John Conchar, Zaire Williams, and Brandon Clark at your center. And then there's that four spot, right? We saw Jake LaRavia get the first crack at it. We saw David Roddy get the second crack at it, when he came in the fourth quarter. But what about Kenneth Lofton Jr., playing at that four spot? For one, I'm a big advocate for him playing the four a little bit more than the small ball five, because at the four, we talked about this in the past, but there just aren't a lot of natural power forwards in the NBA anymore. A lot of teams are playing those combo wings, at the four spot as small ball fours to emphasize pacing, to emphasize spacing, to emphasize, those two aspects of the NBA that are actually, huge parts of the game right now. But the Grizzlies can counter that. The Grizzlies can counter that by throwing Kenneth Lofton in there. And if we know anything about Kenneth Lofton Jr., he abuses mismatches. You have to have a strong guy. You have to have some size. You look at the Summer League. I always go back to this because this was the matchup I was interested to see how he would fare against the most. The one matchup I think that Kenneth Lofton Jr. didn't dominate, or he struggled more against in Summer League, was against David McCormick, the rookie center out of Kansas, the national champions from this past collegiate basketball season. And David McCormick, 6'10", 7-foot guy, 250 pounds, and he's muscle. So it's like, okay, Lofton Jr. won't be able to just knock this guy out the way at will, and he's taller. So if you've seen Kenneth Lofton Jr. play, he has no problem scoring on taller guys. I actually was looking at some highlights recently because Victor Wembanyama, if you've heard, it's going to be the number 1 pick next NBA draft, and he's the real deal. He's 7'4". He's very skinny, though. So there are actually some highlights from when Kenneth Lofton Jr. was with Team USA of him scoring on Victor Wembanyama. So go check those out on YouTube as well. I think go watch Locked On Grizzlies. But, Victor Wembanyama kind of, had a couple, moments where he got knocked back against Kenneth Lofton Jr. And that's a point where I say size doesn't really matter against this guy, Junior. As the fan base, as he likes to be called, against Junior. Size doesn't matter. So what matters the most, I think the most effective way to kind of, offsetting Kenneth Lofton Jr.'s strengths is you can't be tall and skinny. He's going to go straight through you. Not only you can't be his height, because then he has an advantage. You have to be tall, and you have to have long arms, and you have to be, a guy who's strong. If you are skinny, you have to be very strong. I hope you are, because that's the only way that you can kind of offset some of the strengths. And that's what I got out of that matchup with David McCormick. So we'll see, if we see more of Kenneth Lofton Jr. in this game. I think there's a good solid chance that he gets some run late. But as I mentioned earlier, lineup combinations are going to be tried out with Taylor Jenkins. That could be one. Inserting him into the second unit, seeing how he progresses there. I would imagine that David Roddy, who Taylor Jenkins and his teammates have lauded for his defensive versatility so far, will probably get the first crack. Kenneth Lofton Jr. is another option in that situation. I think this game overall is just going to be an interesting, another opportunity to watch these preseason Grizzlies grow. If we're being picky, there were some turnovers. There were, the Grizzlies didn't shoot the ball well from three-point range. 3 points has been a huge emphasis this offseason. It's been an emphasis at all 3 levels of this franchise. Let's go with the top. Zach Kleiman, right? Zach Kleiman drafted these guys, and he mentioned to us, on draft night, all these guys shoot the basketball well. Jake LaRavia, David Roddy, Kennedy Chandler, Vince Williams, all positive 3-point shooters at the collegiate level. Even if you look at Junior, we have seen him in Summer League knock down threes. We saw him in the first preseason game knock down his first 3 from the top of the key with no problem, to the point where he's able to pump fake and take guys over the dribble. So all 5 rookies that the Grizzlies have bought in are capable of shooting the 3-point ball. 3-pointers was a big emphasis. So let's go down to the head coach side of things. Taylor Jenkins, he and the staff have this let it fly mentality. They encourage guys to shoot all the time. We mentioned earlier on one of the earlier episodes, Steven Adams has the green light. Brandon Clark has a green light if he's open and he wants the shot. And it goes all the way down to the rookies. And how do I know this? Well, we talked to Jake LaRavia about this yesterday. And then 2, action speaks louder than words. You saw Jake LaRavia in the Summer League. I actually debated on if we should talk about this more over the course of a full episode. So if you think we should get deeper into Jake LaRavia's, shooting, and his confidence there, let me know in the comments, and we will provide an episode going deeper into that. But with Jake LaRavia, if you saw the last preseason game, this stood out to me, and probably didn't stand out to a lot of people because he didn't make many, But in that first quarter, Jake LaRavia came out shooting. 4 3-point attempts in the first quarter, only made 1. And a couple were some ugly misses, but 4 3-point shots in the first quarter. We've seen John Conchar come out and talk about shooting the basketball more. He did it again yesterday, talked about how, in his role, he's going to get a lot of those corner 3-point shots, and he's going to take them. So this let it fly mentality that Taylor Jenkins is carrying down into the players, it's definitely going through their heads. So we talked about how the Grizzlies, last season when we previewed that Timberwolves series, we talked about how the Timberwolves was such a good 3-point shooting team as compared to the Grizzlies, who don't shoot or do not make, in the upper tier of 3-point shots. But Taylor Jenkins has this emphasis this year. It's funny because we've talked about mid-range shooting and the Grizzlies being one of the worst mid-range shooting teams, and there being a need to improve there. But Taylor Jenkins says, throw it out the window. Mid-range shooting, Who cares? He didn't exactly say that, but he said the emphasis on this team is three-pointers and layups. Less floaters, less mid-range shots were his exact words, which was interesting to me because I've talked about it and I've written about, the floater. Ja Morant having one of the better floaters in the NBA. Tyus Jones having one of the better floaters in the NBA. Brandon Clark statistically having a floater on par with MVP, two-time MVP Nikola Jokic as the best big man floater in the NBA. So, less floaters, less mid-range shots is what Taylor Jenkins wants. More layups, more three-pointers. We'll see how that, plays out not only in the regular season, but we'll see how it plays out in this upcoming preseason game as well. Thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen each and every day. Next episode, we're going to have a lot to talk about. We're going to recap some of the takeaways from this game against the Miami Heat. There's an open practice for fans on Sunday. So if you're in town, Grizzlies fans, go check out the open practice because you'll get to see some of the things that I've been seeing, and we'll be able to talk about that as well coming up on Locked On Grizzlies. But now you've watched us here on Locked On Grizzlies. Now for your second listen, go tune into the Locked On Fantasy Basketball Podcast. Josh Lloyd is the host over there, and he hosts the #1 daily fantasy basketball show on the planet. It's free, and it's available wherever you get your podcast, the Locked On Fantasy Basketball. Go check it out. And again, free and available wherever you get your podcast. Thank you again for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen today, and we appreciate you for tuning in. It's going to be a fun preseason game coming up against the Heat. Looking forward to seeing, the rookies again. Looking forward to seeing if there's some consistency. We've seen Santi Aldama play well in 2 games. See if he can stack it up and do it for a third time. Ja Morant gave us, a very tantalizing performance. Desmond Bane, 0-5 from three-point range, even though he shot 5 of 8 in twos, 5 of 13 overall. 0-5 from three-point range in that last preseason game. Let's see if he can turn it on from three-point range like we've grown accustomed to seeing from him. Dylan Brooks got it off to a slow start as well offensively. Let's see if he can get off to a quicker start. A lot of things to watch, Grizzlies fans, but I'm going to be tuned in. I'll be there at the FedEx Forum having the game covered for you, and you should tune in as well. But thank you for tuning in to Locked On Grizzlies. We'll see you next time.